Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back in to answer the age-old question, disc or holy, as this is something I get almost every single season, particularly for a Mythic Plus environment. Let's start talking about the strengths and weaknesses that each of them have going into this season. Big thing is that Holy got a bit of changes in 10.2.6 right before this patch came out, where Divine Word is split from Divine Image, and now they're their own respective capstone slots, allowing you to run both of them. Light Well also got a couple buffs, and I played a few dungeons with that as well. And Disc largely remaining the same, keeping the same Season 3 tier set, the same sort of strengths, and also some of the same weaknesses. So we're going back to all the Dragonflight dungeons, Ruby Life Pools, Neltharis, Azurvald, you know, the works. And as a result, the damage patterns are also changing quite a lot. You're going back to Halls of Infusion, where you have steady boss damage in Khajiit, and there's just constant healing required and really high HPS checks. You also have Uldaman coming back with the crazy burst damage that you'll have out of a number of boss fights, both for Bromak, the Trog guy, as well as the final boss in Chronolord Deos, with the big knockbacks, also the intermission phase with the steady burst damage. So, which one's feeling best? Well, let's start talking about the strengths and weaknesses of each. Holy Priest, of course, with that revamp, is able to use Divine Word and Divine Image together, and Divine Word helps the spec do tremendous amounts of damage. It was already doing a lot as is, even with the old Imperial Blaze talent, which was just a button that you had to activate and then you could hit your Holy Fires. But now by rolling Imperial Blaze into Chastise, so after you hit Chastise, you get 2 instant cast Holy Fires to follow up with, you are doing ridiculous amounts of overall damage. And when you're coordinating Divine Word for the damage increase and Apotheosis for the Holy Word resets, you are just doing ridiculous amounts of overall damage and actually having a significant impact on what I'd really like to call timing pulls. Pulls where you're grabbing everything together, popping Lust, popping big cooldowns, and you need to kill those things before they kill your tank, or casts go through because you run out of stops and they just kill your group. And for that, Holy does a crazy good job of it. In fact, you can even start lasering down specific enemies by dumping Holy Fire casts into one, or you can start sort of spreading them out so that the dots are able to hit people a little bit more evenly, but just generally getting a huge amount of the cleave damage out makes a really hefty impact on some of the overalls. I was doing, I think, even 400 or 500k on some of our opening pulls in a few different instances, and how you can use Holy Fire, Chastise, follow it up with Holy Novas, because now, thanks to, it was called Harmonious Apparatus, now it's called Voice of Harmony, your Holy Nova can now reduce the cooldown of Chastise so that you can get more Chastises for more Holy Fires, which also give you more Chastises, and you have an immense amount of damage, and it feels incredible, let me tell you. So, as a result, yes, damage is absolutely a strong suit for Holy, but actually, our job is to keep people alive. How do we fare there? That being said, Holy has always, really, in Dragonflight and even in Shadowlands, has really just been this whack-a-mole healer where you're single targeting everybody to full over and over again. That hasn't really changed in Season 4. It gets a little easier as you can use Divine Word. I even was experimenting around with Lightwell to see how that operated with. At least so far, it seemed okay, but there were moments where I'd either consume all of my bolts really fast. I was on like Khajiit 15 at like 502 eye level or something crazy, and I just oomed out of nowhere. And then there were also moments where I felt like I'm running away from my Lightwell and I kind of run out of bolts. So I'm not a huge fan of running with that. I did mess around with a little bit of Lightweaver, and I think that might help me for Khajiit specifically, for like the attrition healing with how much output is required for such a long period of time. The spec doesn't really have mana problems in 99% of cases, but I think when you're stuck in this encounter that can go to like 4 minutes on Tyrannical or 3.5 or something crazy, and you just need to blast output constantly, eventually, yes, you will if you're flash healing. So that's where I was messing around with Lightweaver, and I think that's the only application I would have for it this season, because otherwise, if you have other encounters where you need to just mash out those flash heals, it's usually a lot burstier, and that's where Divine Word used with Serenity for the increased healing out of flash shield and the mana cost savings for it becomes really, really helpful so that you can spam out that burst of flash shields that you need, generate new holy words and all that fun stuff, and then be able to kind of continue with your usual healing profile. So on a lot of encounters where there's lots of single target damage that you need to be healing each time, some of the encounters that kind of come to mind would be the Sentinel in Uldaman that has like the constant bleed damage that's going out, even being able to like whack-a-mole people on Tira and Maruk in the Naku defensive where there's arrows. You kind of just, all right, this person's targeted by arrow, they get a flash shield. Next person targeted by arrows, they get a flash shield. You kind of go down the line and topping the previous casted person with some of the Trail of Light, your Echo, some of the latent renews that are going out from your tier set. All of those kind of come into play and work out really well. That being said, there's some difficult areas, especially when the party is not going to be stacked or they don't want to be stacked. Because when you have large bursts of AoE and players are not stacking with you, I think Chronolord Deus is probably one of the hardest encounters for Holy Priest to be able to heal successfully on Tyrannical, because you naturally have everybody just running all over the place, and it becomes like bedlam trying to hunt everybody down, and you're sort of stuck in a position where you can't really use your Sanctifies until you're going into the intermission phase where people will actually stack in those sand piles. But that's not quite the area where you really need to make sure you're relying on that output, right? Running Phantasm is fantastic for that encounter because it'll allow you to remove the slow effect, the debuffs that he's putting out that need to be dispelled. You can just fade and remove it from yourself, but that fight feels very, very difficult to deal with. Whereas going into like Ruby Life Pools, we did a Ruby Life Pools 14 Tyrannical as Holy. We did a double Priest, double Evoker comp, right? Get this. And in this one, we actually were able to get everybody in voice, communicate, figure out, problem solve, right? And it was so much easier to be able to work with because you could get everybody stacked. And a lot of boss fights favored being stacked as well. So whether it was the first ice boss, Meladrusa, you're able to have everyone stacked, mash out your Sanctifies when you can, and then just kind of whack-a-mole whoever is the most vulnerable. Same thing with the second boss, but then obviously with the final boss, you're having all of the flame spits that are going out, and Holy felt great for that because now it's been nerfed, so there's only 2 of the flame spits instead of like 3 or 5 or whatever it was previously. It was a nightmare before. So for those instances where people can stack, you can at least communicate that they can stack with you. There's a lot of areas where Holy can feel pretty good and nearly on the same level, I would say, of Disc's AoE healing. But that comes with the stack requirements, the coordination requirements on hand. When you're in an environment where you're straight pugging, which I also had this week, and people are spread to the 4 winds, it gets tremendously more difficult. And that's where, as a Holy Priest, you kind of have to make yourself tankier to solve this problem. So with the next Booleon that we're going to get, you'll be able to purchase an item. I'm really debating between getting like a Rage Heart or a Ward, so that way I can either use Ward on myself or somebody else, protect them, and not have to worry about bombing single target heals into them, while I kind of pick around and focus on everybody else from there. For Discipline, it's really weird to say, but this just doesn't do as much damage as Holy Priest. Shockingly, right? They used to be pretty close together, or at least close enough that you would have to work really hard for Holy to out-damage Disc, because Disc does it so naturally. But now, even just being able to weave in a Holy Fire every now and then, Holy Priest does quite a bit more damage in general. That being said, Disc does a lot better, I think, in just the overall burst healing that M+ throws at you. And it does a really good job of keeping people around you alive through the absorbs, pain sups, barriers, rapture shields, whatever it is, to make sure that you're providing a bit of extra survivability element to all of your surrounding allies. Even the 3% damage reduction of Lenience can come in clutch, especially as we're trying to do, 13s and 14s when we're at, effectively normal raid eye level. So trying to do 22s with normal raid gear, possible, yes, but very difficult to be able to survive. So what is that burst healing that I'm talking about? Well, we mentioned it a little bit just a second ago with Ruby Life Pools and how bursty that kind of damage can be, but it's also pretty prominently featured in a few different higher level dungeons. Things like Nakud, Neltharis, Halls of Infusion. I think Halls is a great example because the very first boss, you can quickly get into execute phase, but there is just nothing but like bursts of damage that you need to be able to contend with, and it's often hits that are going out in waves. So you're going to have 3 or 4 bursts of damage from the static coming from the first boss in Halls that you need to make sure that you're pushing up everybody's health pool as rapidly as you can and doing it equally together so they're going to be stabilized. And Disc is able to do a great job with that, especially when you're planning the uses of your Mindbender so that you're not just kind of sending them out willy-nilly, but you're setting it up, putting your atonements out, and then blasting a huge Mind Blast into Penance to elevate those health pools, and then continue DPSing to get the additional cooldown reduction for your pet and be ready for the next round. While neither of the specs really has great mobility, it does feel like if you plan and kind of know what's going to come, Disc can do a little bit better of a job, especially when you need to heal everybody equally, thanks to both Penance and with Shadow Word Death. There's a lot of times where I'm able to rely on like that Shadow Word Death output, where I'm finding the right target, triggering Shadow Word Death on them, getting the Inescapable Torment cleave for a longer duration Squid, longer duration Shadow Covenant, and then being able to continue moving into the positions that I need to. Holy, you're kind of in a position where, yeah, you might have some like Holy Fires that you get for free at a Chastise. You kind of have some Holy Words on hand. Otherwise, it's maybe some Surge procs. You want to make sure you're planted as often as you possibly can, and it's a little bit more difficult to plan around those uses. Like I said, when we've been doing these dungeons, we're also doing it with really low eye level, making it incredibly difficult to make sure you're surviving some of these hits. It almost feels like the casts in a lot of these dungeons, you can survive getting hit by some of the bolts, but the boss mechanics in particular, since I guess it is Tyrannical Week that we're recording this, it's really, really noticeable when the boss fights are coming out and every single mechanic is just chunking you for like almost all of your life. I've had a few different runs where Evokers in particular have been some of the squishiest specs that I've been playing around, and often I'm finding myself just always putting on the Atonement, always putting on the extra shield onto them to make sure they're surviving some of these incoming hits, because I know that they're going to be taking more damage than some of the other people on hand. I do think that's one of the big advantages that Disc especially has, is while Priest in general can kind of always have something, they can always have like Protective Light, which is the flash heal DR, Fade is up very regularly, and then of course they have a shield. Having all of those sort of together for Disc and stronger shields on top of that makes it feel like you're just a little bit tankier than everybody else. We had like a Halls of Infusion run where everybody would just died on like the last boss to like the AoEs going out, and I was able to just continuously be surviving by leaning on Rage Heart, by leaning on my absorbs, and of course by leaning on my externals. I've already seen a few different examples of tanks getting annihilated by even tyrannical trash mobs in the 12s and 14s that we've been doing thus far. And so I expect when we get around into a fortified week that Disc can have an extra advantage by the pain sub charges and how much stronger pain sub is as an external than Guardian Spirit. So I'm really eager to sort of try that out. In general, it's tough to be able to provide enough output for a tank, though, I will say, because you might counter it by saying, well, if Disc has better externals, then Holy's going to be able to have better single target healing, like you said. And that's mostly true. I just don't know if the tank's going to live long enough for you to be able to push up their health pools to make sure that you keep them alive. A few of the tank deaths that I've seen have been areas where like mitigation drops and then they just 100 to 0 just perish in like half a second or something along those lines. And so that's where 40% damage reduction might give them enough wherewithal, it might give them enough time to like get out of trouble, get a resource back or whatever, but it's difficult to be able to push healing into the tanks enough to make sure you stabilize them, at least from my experiences with Vengeance Demon Hunter, maybe different tanks, but in general it is tough to be able to find different tanks in the meta, in the world that we are in for Season 4. So which of the healers would I recommend that you play along your adventures? Honestly, whichever one that you really prefer and you really enjoy. I think that the overall profile of healing, while it's changed in the dungeons, it hasn't changed too gravely with Holy or with Disc. I think if you're going to continue pushing up in like a high key environment, while there have been some Holy Priests who every season are pushing up, it helps when they get everybody into voice. It helps when they know where people are going to be positioned so that they can figure out how they're best going to be utilizing those resources, right? And this is where I would say, especially for those Holy mains who are interested, make sure you get Ward of Faceless Ire. Because so much of the emphasis for the spec when you do need to crank single target healing is predicated on hitting the most vulnerable player. And grabbing an item like Ward with a minute cooldown and a fat absorb allows you to ignore temporarily that one person that you place it on while you focus on triaging people who are in greater need. Disc also will love that trinket, and it'll be fantastic. I do think that it matters a lot for the output, and I guess you could say the priority of how Holy Priest plays, though. At the moment, the Season 4 meta is really heavy on VDHs, Resto Druids, Shadow Priests, Aug Evokers, Mages, the works, right? And so it's been a bit more difficult to actually get invites as a Priest Healer than it was last season, where Priest Healers were insanely good, and Season 3 start was not that friendly to Shadow Priest at all. That being said, if you're able to find those groups, and the more that you're able to find those groups that are not playing with Shadow Priest or playing with like maybe Boomkin instead or Warlock instead, those groups felt a lot better to be able to play with than some of like the Disc and Shadow or Holy and Shadow Priest groups that I've run, where you really just find yourself kind of lacking in the stops for the trash mobs. I think that trend is going to continue, and I'm hoping that we get, some manner of balance to actually flex around with some of the tanks and healers, because it does seem like at the start of the season, we really nailed down, like everybody in the community just nailed down God Comp and was like ready to roll with it. And I'm already seeing just from week 1 where people are really trying to drill down and focus on like running these ultra fodum comps all the time, which is annoying. And it's usually stopped by them having lots of class changes at the beginning where people have to figure out what's good. And in the process of figuring out what's good, a lot of off meta specs are actually able to, play the game, get IO, make friends, network, and all that other fun stuff with other like-minded people. We don't quite have that at the moment, but some class changes would actually help tremendously in that regard. I know they did actually have some nerfs for healers just before the season ended up starting, but it didn't really impact M+ in a large fashion because a lot of the output for healers is, well balanced. It comes down to the stops, it comes down to which is the best spec of each class if they bring like raid buffs. And it also comes down to how everything sort of fits together. And so when Vengeance Demon Hunter is the strongest tank for the stops they bring, then you're looking at which healer is going to work well with that. Well, which of the healers is already taken up by a DPS slot? Well, hey, Shadow Priest is. So there's less emphasis on the Priest healer. So as a result, you can already have like the early season getting shaped by that. But don't let that discourage you from the fact that you can actually heal these really incredibly high keys and be extremely successful by playing Priest in this incoming season. I'm doing it, many other people are doing it, and I would definitely encourage you, if you're enjoying either of the Priest specs, to pick which one you enjoy and level it up from there. And if you're enjoying both of them, start using ring crafts and start farming rings, neck pieces, things like that have a lot of the secondary stats that you want to be able to build 2 different sets to be able to play with. Holy will want to have like 30-ish% haste or so and then just go hard verse from there, whereas Disc is going to want 40% or even more haste and then go verse afterwards. You can absolutely build 2 functional sets to be able to push keys as either of the specs. That's what I've been doing so far in this season, and I would greatly encourage you guys to do so as well. So let me know what you think, and if you have any other questions about Holy and Discipline for the incoming season, I also have our Season 4 guides, which you should be sure to check out as well on our channel. Thanks so much for watching. Huge thank you to all our patrons, Twitch subs, YouTube members that make all of this content possible. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch y'all next time.